Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about a topic so huge to history buffs that we can only discuss a tiny little fraction of it. I'm, of course, referring to paratroopering. No, World War II. World War II is the only historical event that has, like, its own cable channel. Well, I should say it used to have its own cable channel. These days, the History Channel is, of course, devoted primarily to lumberjacks, and oh my gosh, is that guy really going to shoot an alligator? Who knew how nostalgic we could be for documentaries about Joseph Stalin? So here at Crash Course, we like to focus on causes and effects of wars rather than strategy and tactics, but given the importance that World War II has in the American imagination, we're going to discuss those a bit too today. We're going to defy Maria von Trapp and start before the very beginning, because America's ideas about foreign policy were shaped by two things: the Great Depression and World War I. After the American experience of World War I, it's not surprising that Americans were just a smidge gun-shy about involvement in foreign affairs. Seriously, Stan, a gun pun now? No. Now, America actually came out of World War I stronger than ever, but man, did a lot of people die for not much change. I mean, I guess the Treaty of Versailles sort of remade Europe, but it didn't make it better. And the League of Nations was a flop, and generally there was a lot of disappointed idealism. The period of time between 1920 and the US entry into World War II has been called an age of isolationism, although that isn't 100% accurate. However, we were isolationist in the sense that the United States was much less involved in world trade, largely because of the Depression. You know, that meant that there wasn't much world trade, but also because of tariff policies. But there was also something isolationist about the formal actions of Congress. Like after Europe and Asia began to become belligerent in the 1930s with Japan's invasion of China and Italy's invasion of Ethiopia and the rise of fascist dictators in Spain and, of course, Germany, Congress responded by passing a series of neutrality acts which banned the sale of arms to belligerents, even if they were really nice tea-drinking belligerents who we were pals with. The US didn't officially get involved in the war until 2 years after Hitler invaded Poland, but America was deeply involved in the European war before we actually sent troops. FDR really wanted to help the Allies, especially the Brits, who, after the French surrender in 1940, were the only ones actually fighting the Nazis until 1941, when there were a whole lot of Russians also fighting them. Even Congress recognized that the Nazis were a threat, and in 1940, it agreed to allow cash and carry arms sales to Great Britain. The sale of arms were cash sales, meaning that they were not paid for with loans or IOUs, and the carry part meant that the British would carry their own arms over, to Britain. Then in September 1940, Congress created the nation's first peacetime draft, taking the next step toward involvement, and that was a huge deal because, you don't muster an army with no desire to eventually use it. But of course, the event that pushed us fully into the war happened on December 7th, 1941, when Japanese pilots attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. 187 aircraft were destroyed, 18 naval vessels were damaged or destroyed, and more than 2,000 American servicemen were killed. FDR asked Congress for a declaration of war, which they granted, voting 477 to 1, and the day after that, Germany declared war on the United States, and World War II officially became a world war. We almost always start the American story of World War II in Europe because, Hitler. So I'm going to start in the Pacific, where until 1944 there were actually more American personnel deployed than in Europe. Things didn't start well in the Pacific. Let's go to the thought bubble. Perhaps worse than Pearl Harbor was the surrender of 78,000 American and Filipino troops at Bataan. This was the largest surrender by American troops in history, and it resulted in thousands dying on the Bataan Death March to prisoner of war camps, where thousands more would die. But in May 1942, we protected Australia from the Japanese fleet by winning the Battle of the Coral Sea, and then in June, we won a huge victory at Midway Island, midway between Hawaii and Japan, I guess, and probably named by historians. The U.S. strategy in the Pacific has been called island hopping, and it involved taking Japanese-controlled islands one at a time to be used as bases for bombers that could then be used against Japan itself. It was a slow process, and the fighting over these jungly South Pacific islands was fierce and extraordinarily costly. The battle at Guadalcanal went from August 1942 to February 1943, and they didn't freeze like in Stalingrad, but conditions weren't much better. And now let's switch to the European theater. We call this the European War because we were fighting against Europeans, and it ended in Europe, but the first US troops to fight against Nazis actually did so in North Africa, so it's kind of a misnomer. American weaponry was pretty poor, but after our initial invasion in North Africa in November 1942, we got into it, and by 1943, we and the British defeated Rommel in the desert, and we were ready to invade Europe, which should have made Stalin happy because up to this point, Russians had been doing the bulk of the dying in the war. But Stalin wasn't happy, first because he was a mean and nasty person, and those kinds of people are rarely happy, and secondly because rather than invading France and striking at Germany more directly, the Allies invaded Sicily and Italy, where we fought for most of 1943 and much of 1944 until finally, on June 6th, we joined some Brits and Canadians in invading Normandy on D-Day. And that was the beginning of the end for the Nazis. So while Americans did liberate Paris and were part of the final assault on Germany and also liberated a number of concentration camps, Russians did most of the fighting in Europe, losing at least 20 million people, and in the end it was the Russians who captured Berlin. Although the Nazis never really had a chance to win the war after they started fighting the Russians and the Americans entered into it, it didn't actually end until May 8th or 9th, 1945, depending on when you got the news. And the war in the Pacific continued until August. Japan surrendered unconditionally after the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th.